All right.
All right, we're recording now, so welcome to everybody who's here. I will convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, April 12th, 2022. Again, welcome to everybody who's here. First item on the agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it?
There are none from staff.
Okay, and see none from the commission. We have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is our public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us on pretty much any item that you'd like. And I know we have at least Kelly Devine who asked to speak.
Yes,
Do we have
we've
other
also
speakers?
got a few others, Martha Lang, Sharon Bushore, and Kim Doyle is on the line. Not sure if he has a comment.
Okay. Well, Charles, I'll let you go through the people who are on the list because you could see them and I can't.
Great. Martha Lang, we'll start with you, and your microphone is enabled.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Martha. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Nice to see you, Andy. And you,
Sure.
Bruce. I'm here, thank you for your time. I'm here to talk about the rezoning for the Burlington High School out on North Avenue. I'm very concerned that an institutional zone is not appropriate. Burlington High School is a department in the city. In my opinion, it doesn't meet the level of UVM, Champlain College, or the medical center. In addition to that, to establish an overlay district in an institutional zone, that was a multi-month process. I think it took about a year before the overlay district was put in for the institutional zone. May I suggest, not a zoning specialist, but mixed use would be a much better zone for the Burlington High School. In the fact that if you're looking to the future, they're concerned about other plots of land that may need to be rezoned for the school department. Mixed use would be suitable, institutional won't. And my last point, and you say, why is Martha concerned? I own property near the school district. And the thought of an 80-foot building within 10 feet of a property line sends shudders down my spine. That's not a precedent that I feel comfortable with. But thank you very much. I do support the schools. They're vital to our future. But I think the way we go about it, and I must say, I've been harping on the zoning change for decades. Why they waited till the last minute, I don't know. But anyway, I just thought I'd give my opinion. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Good to
Thanks,
see all of
Martha.
you. Thank
you too. Charles, who do we have next?
Next, we're going to go to Sharon Bushore.
Welcome, Sharon.
Hi, hi, good evening. I'm actually don't have a lot to offer. I was wondering if Barbara Hedrick was in the queue because she did communicate with me a concern she had regarding the parking ordinance, and it has to do with the institution and the joint parking plan. And in that language, it says that the DRB will receive it. Chip Mason, as chair of ordinance, had asked that it said that they would, the DRB would adopt it, and that, or approve, whatever. And that language is missing. So I'm offering that on behalf of Barbara because she was concerned about that. If she's here in the queue, she can speak more about that. Other than that, I'm really here to listen to your comments on this, on the TDM portion. And also I'm very interested in the site that was chosen in advance of the ordinance for the pods. Although I support those, I am concerned about the lack of process for the neighbors. And so I'm hoping that whatever you conclude will include a process that at least brings it to the attention of the neighborhood where a shelter like this or a housing project, however you want to define it, temporary or not, would have a process like other developments where you go at either to the NPA or specifically to the neighborhood and get their input. I think that's really important because I think you do a lot of good by hearing and maybe slightly modifying. I'm not asking to abort, I'm just asking to listen and to modify if appropriate. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Charles, who do we have next?
Next, we're going to go to Kelly Devine.
Thank you very much. I'm Kelly Devine. I'm the Executive Director of the Burlington Business Association. So I guess I have to echo what I heard Councilor Busher say, which is not speaking specifically to the decision about the Pod Village on Elmwood Avenue, because I think that's a different decision-making group than this one, but speaking more specifically to the matter before the Planning Commission, which is to provide administrative approval for these projects. So I've been doing some research on similar villages around the country in some of the cities that have been kind of pioneers on this, Eugene, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, Madison, Wisconsin, just to understand both their process and the kind of documentation they have for these villages and what kind of rules are set, because we intend to work hopefully with the CETO and the administration to have some input on things like code of conduct and rules. And what I'm seeing pretty universally is pretty extensive paperwork that's developed, which I find really interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from as a community. And I know that in Portland, Oregon, for the very first community that they put up, they had actually 2 years of process, including close to a year working with the neighbors and potential residents. And, this current process that I'm seeing move forward seems to, in my opinion, left a lot of people out of the conversation. Folks like the street outreach team, Spectrum, COTS, the actual people who are houseless have not had a voice in the conversation. Church Street Marketplace District did not have a vote on the site location. Other city departments did. So if it's the interest of the administration and the Planning Commission to support an administrative approval, I really hope that you will seriously consider to accompany that administrative request or that permit request would be a packet of documents similar to the ones I've seen for these other communities, because I do think that, for this to have any chance of being a success, I think that, there are inherent risks to it. There certainly is plenty of misinformation circulating around. And these documents that I've read seem to really help to better put parameters around what community expectations are, what expectations are among people who live there, what the redress is, how you get admitted, how you might be asked to leave. Some of them, not all of them, allow alcohol and drug use. Some do, many don't. And it just seems to me that short of having that packet to review and really understand who's going to manage it, how it's going to manage it, who's going to live there, what they're expected to do, how long they will stay, it just seems to me inadequate to have administrative approval of a project like that without this sort of almost booklet of documents. So I'm happy to share any of the research I've done with the commission, but I do think it's important to be considering that with something that I think is this untested, this new of a concept. And, I think it could go really well, which would be great for Burlington, and it could not, which I think could be not so great for Burlington. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you, Kelly.
Andy, we have one more speaker, Tim Doyle.
Okay. Hello, Tim. Welcome.
Tim, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I raised my hand. That was accidental. I was just kind of listening in today.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for joining us.
And we do have Aaron here in the room. I don't know, you said you didn't want to speak during public forum?
No.
Okay, I think he's just here to listen, so. Okay.
So was that it, Charles? Anyone else, or are we all set?
That is it, Andy. We're all set.
Well, thanks to everybody who spoke to us during public forum. We will close that now. We're on to item 3, which is the chair's report. I don't have anything to report, so we'll move on to item 4, which is director's report. Megan.
Okay, I have several items to share with you. Some updates on items that you've worked on previously or things that are coming up on upcoming agendas. The first is that you've probably seen the city council met last night. This is the first meeting of the new city council. We have several new members, not all new to us, but new to the city council. And one of the items that they took up was the reintroduction of the short-term rental issue. One of the city councilors proposed a recent version of the packet of both the zoning and minimum housing ordinance amendments and asked for that to be referred to their ordinance committee to discuss with a time certain return to the council. So depending on the outcome of the council's ordinance committee process and the feeling of the council at large, this is an issue that may come back to you at some point in the future. The work that you had previously done, I think we had updated you on, was ultimately vetoed. The Chapter 18 amendments were ultimately vetoed by the mayor, and the companion zoning amendments have expired as of tomorrow, actually. So if this issue gets referred back to you, it will require us to reboot the zoning piece of that process. You heard tonight about a comment about the high school zoning. We're anticipating that this issue will come back in front of the Planning Commission in May, actually. But just wanted to let the commission know, if you haven't already seen, the high school the design team has presented 5 different concept plans for the high school's redevelopment to the board. They're actually holding a community meeting tonight, I think, as we speak. And the school board will be weighing in on those options later this month. So definitely encourage you to take a look. There's a pretty well done presentation packet that shows the plans and a few conceptual images from the street level of what the buildings could look like from a massing perspective. And I think there's also some material online that help just evaluate or help explain some of the criteria that the design team was evaluating in thinking about these concepts. And if you'd like, I can send the link to you all for that information. Tonight you have an ordinance in front of you that originated at the city council level, the parking ordinance. The process that we are in at this stage is one of a technical piece of the Planning Commission's review of this amendment. You have previously talked about this ordinance in great detail, and we'll provide an update to you tonight about what has changed since you referred it back to the city council. But ultimately, you're being requested to approve the municipal bylaw amendment report and warn a public hearing, which is part of the statutory process for adopting a zoning amendment. The other item that's in front of you that we'll talk about tonight, I think is important just to note, is part of the housing action plan that was announced back in December, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail. The specific zoning question that you're considering tonight, while it's related to ongoing work associated with the Elmwood pod site, actually is not, was not originally a question that was part of that housing action plan. This is something that really emerged from a kind of cross-departmental effort to look at how we could actually implement a pod site in the city and understanding some of the limitations of our zoning. So we'll get into that a little bit more in detail when we get to that item, but just wanted to make that note at the start of this discussion. A quick staffing update, a really exciting development to share with you is that we have extended an offer that has been accepted to our new planner. We are going to be welcoming a woman named Sarah Morgan to our team in May. You may remember that this is the position that the commission supported having created in the department after David's departure. So this is the first new planner position that we've had in our department on the long range planning side in our department's history. So it's very exciting to be adding this capacity. Charles and I are both very excited to welcome Sarah to our team. She's got a lot of great energy and skills from the work that she's been doing at a nonprofit looking at environmental justice issues in Ohio, actually. So we're really looking forward to having her and Charles actually both here in Burlington next week to get to have some time in the office and on the ground in Burlington ahead of both of their moves to Burlington this summer. And I also just wanted to share with you that I will be out of the office from April 27th through May 6th. I will be attending the National Planning Conference, which is back on in person for the first time in a few years. And then we'll be doing some family travel after that. So we're working on a number of items that we're hoping to get kind of out in front of you or out in the work that we're doing with other partners before that time. And I'm looking at Michael and realizing that I forgot one update that I had promised, which is an update on some of the other zoning amendments that you all have started to talk about that we're hoping to get in front of you again soon. Michael in particular had asked for an update on just where we were with the discussion about the enterprise zoning and considering housing in a part of the district. So I'm really excited with Charles coming on board and getting more into the weeds of the work we're doing here to say that he's taking on a big role in helping us to further explore some of the questions about a zoning district that allows housing in part of the South End. We've been working with a small working group of stakeholders that either are property owners or represent some of the interests in the neighborhood to have some conversations about what that zoning amendment might entail. And we have previously presented this concept at a very high level at the Ward 5 NPA meeting. So we definitely expect within the coming month that there will be more information to share in a kind of public setting about what we're hoping to achieve and get some feedback about the direction of this zoning amendment so that it can come back to you with some kind of recommendation on how to address the issues that you heard about the last time we talked about this. And I think I can wrap up there. I think that's it.
Great, thank you. And it's great to hear that the department is staffing up so well and so nicely. Nice job doing that. So that brings us on to item 5, which is proposed TDO amendment ZA-22-07, maximum parking and TDM. Who is going to kick this off for us?
I'll kick this off initially as at the high level and then ask Charles and Scott to add in anything else that I missed. So as I mentioned in the director's report, this is an item that was originally referred to you and actually came back for a thorough review and discussion at the Planning Commission level at your request. We took your recommended changes to both the text of the ordinance and your written recommendations about how TDM is integrated into this back to the Council's Ordinance Committee at in March. And they discussed all of those recommendations over the course of 2 meetings. For the most part, the Ordinance Committee accepted the changes that you had offered to them. The ones that came up in the course of our discussion, as well as things that the staff had flagged about how to make this work properly. And ultimately, I think there were just a couple of issues that stood out that the Ordinance Committee had a different kind of perspective on how to address. The first was the Planning Commission's recommendation was to exempt parking within the form districts from the maximum limits. And the Ordinance Committee was not comfortable with that idea, primarily because they felt that it was counter to the purpose of setting maximum limits on parking. The other recommendation that they talked quite a bit about was your recommendation to defer expansion of the Tdm requirements into other parking districts within the city. Ultimately, they weren't comfortable deferring completely, so they recommended another approach, which builds off of some of the pieces of the TDM that we have in place today. There's a two-tier structure for the TDM requirements in this proposal that's in front of you tonight. The first is expanding the requirement to meet all of the aspects of the TDM plan for developments over a certain size citywide. So previously, our ordinance only required TDM plans for 10 or more dwelling units, or essentially 15,000 square feet of development within our new multimodal mixed-use parking district. So the version of the ordinance that you have tonight expands that, those thresholds of requirement for TDM plans to all parking districts in the city. The other threshold, which is a lower threshold, I think they talked quite a bit about some of the concerns that the commission had shared about how those TDM plan requirements can scale down to smaller developments. So they proposed they recommended something that was similar to what one of the planning commissioners had suggested, which is that for projects of between 5 and 9 units, they are only required to unbundle parking. So that is their main TDM contribution in this piece of the ordinance at this time. And then the last piece that the ordinance committee changed wasn't necessarily in response to any of the planning commission's recommendations, but they did talk a little bit more in detail about how the joint institutional parking management plan process will work, and asked for essentially for there to be a greater weight given to the preparation and approval of the plan by the DRB. So we have pulled in some language that we borrowed from the TDM plan language, which says that, you know, not only is a plan required, the DRB has to approve it. And the lack of a plan, an approved plan, is actually a violation of the zoning ordinance, and that an approved plan is a prerequisite to obtaining a zoning permit. So they felt it was really important to make sure that those kind of standards for making sure a plan is in place were strengthened, and the DRB's role in that was strengthened. In referring this back to you, one of the things that we were talking about is just kind of doing a technical review and making sure everything was looked like it was kind of in line to be moved forward for a public hearing. And we noticed, as we always do, a couple of other places within our ordinance that talk about parking that we know that we need to address as this moves forward. So Charles actually did a review of some of the other sections of our ordinance and made some recommendations for how we can address them in terms of their applicability to this overall package. And I'll let him walk through what those changes are now.
Thanks, Megan. I'll keep this brief, but generally will say that these changes sort of relate to translating any mention of parking requirements in the ordinance to parking standards. And you know, similarly, anywhere in the ordinance where, you know, required parking is mentioned, we wanted to make sure that we deleted that. There's a couple other instances where we made some technical changes, including one where there is a sort of last minute clarification that I think Scott Gustin can sort of elaborate a little bit more on, but I'll sort of walk through just what those technical changes were. So they're in Articles 4 and 5. So the first one is regarding development bonuses and additional allowances. So currently in the ordinance, there's a 10-foot or additional FAR bonus within this section of the code, 4.4.1 D5, that states that no less than 25 parking spaces or an additional 10% above the minimum spaces required. And so obviously that portion would be eliminated such that this bonus can still be granted when those 25 parking spaces are made available to the general public at all times. So again, that's a bonus related to the provision of public parking. Very simply in the RH density bonus overlay district, section 4.53 RH, just, eliminating language related to requirements and replacing it with standards. The code still states that at least 75% of parking spaces that are provided in such a district, shall be in a structure, and all of the sort of related regulations requiring parking structure development, including the visibility from other sites, is retained. Just simply mouth of the river overlay 4.5.6, deleting mention of additional parking requirements, that sort of thing. So the section that I mentioned that I think Scott can maybe elaborate on a little bit more is with section 5.3.6 non-conforming lots. So you see in the latter portion of this paragraph, it currently reads, a lot shall be considered non-conforming if there is not sufficient parking as determined by the standards provided in Article 8. Initially, when we reviewed this, we proposed to put language that would say, in such cases where a parking waiver or waivers may be or have been legally granted, such a waiver shall be considered superseded by the standards in Article 8. And maybe I could just stop here and ask Scott to sort of clarify, because I believe it may contradict something that is said later in the ordinance.
Sure. So the wording in this paragraph in subparagraph C in section 536, the wording pertaining to parking was put in place to prohibit the expansion of uses that didn't have the minimum required parking on site. So for example, if we had a triplex that required 6 spaces and only had 2, this wording prevented you from making it a 4-plex, even if the lot was big enough to do that for density. So that's really what it's geared towards. It's geared towards prohibiting expansion of things that don't have the required minimum parking. So the point of this Article 8 Amendment Part 2, in large part, is to toss parking minimums. So I think a cleaner approach is to simply delete the last 2 sentences to take minimum parking out of the nonconformity equation, because it won't be part of what drives nonconformity any longer.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So just two simple fixes: rebuilding after catastrophe, paragraph D in 5.38, just removing language related to parking requirements, and similarly with mobile home parks in 5.4.12, removing the parking space requirement for mobile homes. So that's it for all the technical changes. If anybody has any questions about how or why we went about that, happy to take it.
Are there any questions? So could you just outline again exactly what's being asked of us tonight? Is it to approve the memo, the report, the bylaw report, and warn for public hearing?
Yes, that would be the step for you at this stage. I think if you are comfortable with the change that Scott just suggested to what's in your packet, you might make a motion that says that you would approve the bylaw report and warn the package of amendments with lines 113 through 115 stricken for a public hearing.
Any discussion from the commission? Michael.
This was just a question. I didn't see, so on the institutional side, I get that there was sort of more teeth added to the plan. Was the maximum adopted for institutional? We sort of removed that since it, did they add that? I couldn't tell from looking at the red line.
In the exemptions from the maximum limits? Is that what you're talking about?
So we sort of said no minimums, no maximums for institutional. There's the management plan. Did they add back in maximums? I couldn't tell.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, cool.
They clarified in a different section of the ordinance, there's a list of, I guess, scenarios that are exempt from the maximum limits. And they did fine tune how that was worded to clarify that what is exempted from those maximums are projects and parking spaces that are under an approved plan. They wanted to be clear that it wasn't just parking that's provided that could be part of a plan, but that it actually is part of a plan in order to be exempt.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Anyone else? So to move this forward, it's been requested of us to approve the report and to warn for a public hearing. I don't think doing that at this stage, Megan, means that we support or don't support it. It's just moving this forward. Is that right?
That's correct. This was referred to you by the city council with the request to move it forward through those stages in the process. When you hold your public hearing, the planning commission is asked to do two things. One is to make any technical corrections, which is what Charles outlined for you already. And the other piece is that you're afforded an opportunity to weigh in with any input you would like the council to consider before they take it back up. So this is a little bit different process than what the commission normally follows for a zoning amendment, just because this was something that was referred by the council.
Okay. So Alex, are you scratching or raising your hand?
I am bidding on that high dollar item.
All right.
I was hoping, Megan, could you, if the commission is willing, would you mind repeating what you said, the changes that the city council ordinance committee made? I thought it was fairly brief, but if you would just do me that favor, I'd appreciate it.
Yep, they were pretty straightforward. So they removed parking within the downtown forum districts from the maximum parking exemptions list. They made a slight change to how TDM applies in other parking districts, creating two different tiers. So the full suite of TDM is required for projects of 10 units or more or 15,000 square feet citywide. And just unbundling parking is required for projects of 5 to 9 units citywide.
Mm-hmm.
And then they added some provisions for strengthening the required approval and effectiveness of a joint institutional parking management.
Okay, thank you, Megan.
All right. Do we want to do the actions that were requested of us, which is to move this forward? Michael,
I'll move this forward, refer it for public hearing, I guess, with the changes as discussed.
and it would be approving the municipal bylaw amendment report as well.
Yes, I thought I said that.
Yes,
Yes.
perfect.
I'll second.
So we have a motion by Michael, seconded by Emily. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I didn't see any opposition, so that passes unanimously. Thank you. We're on to item 6, which is proposed CDO amendment, interim emergency shelters. And so just back on that other one, so Megan, you'll schedule it, or Charles, you'll schedule it for the public hearing.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Andy, I just have a question that, and ironically, we have an existing development that may be applicable. And I'm always wondering when we make a major change, how it impacts people who are already in the process or have made substantial plans. And I'm wondering if we could do some outreach to some of those existing permits like Eric has for Cambrian.
I think we can coordinate with Scott to make sure that any of the permits that are on his radar, that people are notified that this is in the process. In terms of the actual effect of considering this, the amendments can move forward without impacting any current projects as it is right now. When it gets back to the city council level and they actually warn a public hearing, when that public hearing notice gets published in the paper, a zoning amendment does become effective at that time. So that's the major kind of threshold that people who have existing permits out there should be looking at. But, you know, for people who are just kind of in early stages of a project, we can also just, you know, as kind of a courtesy notice, just let them know that this is pending.
Great, thanks.
I think you already know.
So unless there's anything else, we'll move again on to item 6, the proposed TDO amendment for interim emergency shelters. Who is going to pick this one up? Hi, Brian.
So Brian and I are going to talk about this one together a bit. So hopefully you'll be able to see my screen here. Hopefully this will work properly. All right. So to kick off the discussion, we just wanted to step up to the high level for a moment and talk about the context in which this zoning amendment is coming to the Planning Commission. Back in January, I had given you all a really quick introduction to the housing action plan that was announced back in December. Admittedly, it was at the end of a meeting, a long discussion about the parking amendment we were just talking about, so we went pretty quickly through this. So we just wanted to touch back on what was included in that housing action plan. Fundamentally, the action plan had 2 main goals. The first was to double the rate of housing production in the city in the next 5 years. And the second is to functionally end chronic homelessness by 2024, I believe it is. And the action plan includes a number of kind of specific sub-targets for those housing production numbers, as well as strategies for helping us both achieve housing production and to address our homelessness challenges. So one of the specific subpoints of that housing action plan, or the production goals of the housing plan, was to support the creation of at least 80 new homes, almost 80 new homes that are provided for formerly homeless residents within the city. So this is kind of a subcomponent of our goal for creating more permanently affordable housing within the next several years. And that, I should just note, is really intended to happen through partnership with other housing developers who will actually create those housing units. These are the strategies that were related to the creation of permanently affordable housing and some of the strategies related to addressing homelessness. And I'll let Brian talk about this piece.
Great. So for the record, it's Brian Pine, CEDO Director. The City Council has already embraced a $3 million investment of the city's ARPA dollars, ARPA being the American Recovery Plan Act funds. And so those $3 million are allocated across a number of initiatives that are actually listed here, and I'll go through them in a minute. In addition, it is envisioned that another 1 to 2 million of the city's ARPA funds will be allocated to develop new permanently affordable housing invested through our partners operating in the community. I would also note that a significant amount of dollars flow from the federal government through the state of Vermont, and we expect that those funds will also be allocated to our priority permanently affordable projects in Burlington through the state of Vermont, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. So I just wanted to clarify that the city's involvement is part of a much bigger investment from our state funding partners. In addition, for the first time in many years, the Housing Trust Fund, that is a voter-approved tax levy, will be fully funded at a penny per $100 of property value. And a penny generates roughly $550,000 a year, and that is a sizable increase to the city's resources that are available to support everything from pre-development to all the way to the completion and lease up of an affordable housing development. So that's an important resource that we're augmenting. In addition, some of the ARPA funds that I mentioned, the 3 million, are actually being used to provide or staff a new staff position in our office. Sarah Russell was appointed to serve as the city's first ever special assistant to end homelessness. She started this past Monday, and she has a big task ahead of her. I'm trying to manage expectations and move that date out to where it was intended to be. But Sarah has a 3-year goal, so by 2025 is what we're shooting for. And Megan mentioned 2024 because the mayor has said 2024, but in fact we made it clear that this is a 3-year commitment. And I want to just point out, this sounds rather utopian and sort of just extremely ambitious. Some people have called it a kind of a local moonshot, but it's actually not that impossible. It really is not impossible at all. Other cities have really made the focus necessary at the municipal level with state, federal, and local partners and faith-based organizations, and really brought the focus. And the single point of accountability is the key here, to have a person working in city government that is focused every day, coming to work focused on this challenge. We've never actually had that level of focus at the city level. We have a person who is partially assigned to work on issues addressing homelessness. We have staff within the police department that work on the results or the outcomes of people experiencing homelessness in terms of trying to manage sites in a way that ensures public safety, but really having someone who's really looking at the systemic levels and developing a really focused effort. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next item. So the next item is our coordinated entry system, which is it's a national approach that we've used in Burlington, but I would say we are significantly upping the investment in this coordinated entry. And what coordinated entry means is that you essentially have, everyone has multiple entry points into an overall system. That system then keeps track of individuals and attempts to serve the needs of those individuals and find the best placement for them, and provides them with the services and the support to move from the instability and the unsafe, insecure housing situation they're in, which is in most cases is unsheltered homelessness, and moves them into housing, or at least into shelter. And in this case, we're noting, I think, that the supply of shelter beds dropped significantly during COVID. The state took on the new hotel voucher program, but that program is shifting to a much more restrictive criteria for eligibility. And the numbers of unhoused, unsheltered, homeless population in Burlington has grown significantly, and we're trying to ensure that we not only chip away at the number, but also provide the level of stability and security that is so essential for people to be able to make that journey from being unhoused and living in the precarious, unstable conditions that go with being unhoused, and moving into a more supportive structure. And that's thus the pod project. The pod project is entirely intended to respond to that and to serve as a bridge to housing, not as an end in and of itself. It really is a bridge. And I want to mention the time needed to develop affordable housing is assembling the financing, assembling sites, getting through permitting. Those things take years. Those are not going to happen immediately. We're trying to deal with an immediate pressing need right now. And that's why when we talk about this action plan, we try and emphasize that the pod is the sort of triage approach to dealing with the most pressing need that we face right now, but not losing sight of the fact that we are looking and making strategic decisions and investments for a more long-term solution.
Thank
That's
you
it for that slide. And did I leave anything out, Megan?
I guess not unless any of the commissioners have any questions for you about any of that. Happy to move on.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, I can't see everybody with the way the screen is, so if anyone has questions, to speak up.
I can see everyone and it looks like everybody's good to go. So we'll move on then. So the other major component of the housing plan that was announced really was a recognition and an incorporation of a number of items that were on your plate already. Major zoning amendments that are helping to target places in our ordinance and places within our community where housing is either not allowed today or where there are barriers to enabling housing to be created. So really continuing this years-long effort that we've all been a part of about trying to make housing easier to create within the city. So as Brian had mentioned, trying to address some of the longer term kind of upstream pieces of housing creation within this spectrum of housing need. So then that brings us to, why we're talking about this potential amendment for interim shelters. I think, as I mentioned in the report at the top of the meeting, the amendment did not come at the specific direction or even was specifically called out in the housing action plan from December. And as you've heard from Samantha Dunn in some of your recent meetings, it's not necessarily needed in order for CEDO to move forward with the shelter pod solution that they're trying to implement at Elmwood Avenue. Really, where this amendment originated was from the staff's work to help identify how the shelter pod concept could move forward and where within the city. And really, like so many of the zoning conversations that we've had as a planning commission, it was about identifying a potential solution and realizing how our current zoning standards may not be nimble enough in order to help us actually realize a solution or an idea that somebody has. In this particular case, we were realizing that the zoning process for emergency shelters is just not nimble in terms of addressing the flexible, rapid, and short-term emergency deployment need for certain types of shelter solutions. So this is really coming to you in the spirit of how do we make our zoning ordinance work better for the different types of applications that we are trying to deploy within our community. I think it's also just important to note why we're talking about, or why this amendment proposes a tiered approach to permitting emergency shelters. It's really in response to a couple of things. One is that it recognizes that sometimes flexible, rapid solutions are needed to help address surges in demand. I didn't hear Brian say this specifically, but I think in previous conversations that I've had with other city departments is that it's really not the goal necessarily of the city to really create a lot more shelter capacity, where our aim is really to create more permanent housing solutions. But we recognize that sometimes there will be situations where we just need to, on an emergency basis, expand the beds available for people to have safer and more dignified housing situations. And this is particularly important at this point of time where we have seen really, I think, and Brian can speak to this, I think exacerbated by the pandemic, we've seen a pretty significant and rapid rise in the number of unhoused people, chronically unhoused people in Chittenden County. We also recognize, as Brian said before, that the implementation of either more permanent shelter types or those permanent housing options, which is ultimately what our goal is, take time to create. And in a particularly constrained housing market like what we're in right now, that time may be even more extended. So this is also recognizing that there are opportunities to deploy shorter term solutions to help us kind of bridge that time horizon. And then finally, the role of certain housing models to act as a bridge. CEDO really talks about shelter housing as a bridge for individuals who are experiencing homelessness to help them find more permanent housing solutions. But what we're also talking about as a zoning amendment is the opportunity for different facility types to act as a bridge within the overall system of housing and services to help address gaps in the need that we have as a community when they emerge. We've started talking about the opportunity for interim shelters, and we've been talking about them as temporary shelters because our community has been talking a lot about this proposal for a shelter pod community on Elmwood Avenue. And that's certainly one potential interim facility that we could imagine under this zoning amendment concept. But there are others, and I think it's important to note that I think a lot of our conversation has focused on the idea of the use of physical structures that might be modular or temporary structures by nature. But this could also just be the time-limited use of an existing building or site to provide an expansion of shelter capacity. Brian mentioned earlier just the current use of a number of hotels across the state for a short period of time to meet an emergency growth in need. But the intention is not for many of those hotels to permanently be shelters. Some of them are being purchased for that purpose, but not all of them. We also know that we've seen church facilities and other kind of civic buildings be used on a temporary basis to help expand beds. And I think it was Alex also that brought up in our last meeting that these interim facilities can also help address gaps in our system when unexpected situations happen. A lot of times we talk about people experiencing homelessness who are folks that are experiencing more kind of chronic paths of homelessness. But as Alex had pointed out, we've seen, a lot of communities have seen an increased need for these sort of temporary solutions to natural or human-induced disasters that really require creativity and speed in order to get them stood up. So these are just some examples of what an interim kind of process for emergency shelter could help us facilitate that are beyond the sort of like pod village concept that we've spent a lot of time talking about. So then quickly to wrap up, just to revisit what the amendment that's in your packet does and doesn't do, and I'll note what is a little bit different from the last time you saw it. There are 4 main areas of the ordinance that are proposed to have kind of a different tier structure for interim facilities versus a permanent facility. The first is with regard to location. So today within our zoning ordinance, emergency shelters are allowed as a conditional use in our residential zoning districts and in our neighborhood mixed use zoning districts. And they are allowed as a permitted use within our downtown form districts. So the map on the right just shows all of those districts where an emergency shelter, a permanent emergency shelter could be enabled today. The amendment that we've been talking about presents just a modest expansion of this. It maintains the allowance for emergency shelters within the districts that I just mentioned, but adds a few additional areas like the enterprise and RCO recreation zones. And I think it's important to note that some of the more recent examples of formal or informal shelter, some sites that people have asked about as potential alternatives to Elmwood Avenue are in these zoning districts. And today, under our zoning ordinance, under our permanent emergency shelter facility standards, those sites would not actually be allowed to be used as emergency shelters. The one caveat to the location within these zoning districts is that they're required to either be on city-owned property or to have an operating agreement with the city. This is a very small excerpt of a map that was created for a different purpose by David a couple of years ago, but this just gives a sense of perspective in the sort of downtown and Old North End area of the city where there are city-owned properties. We're talking about not only limiting these by zoning district, but also by ownership. And this just gives a sense of kind of how that starts to narrow the scope of potential locations for these interim facilities. The next aspect of a shelter permit that this tiered system addresses is the timeline for the permit's operation. Under our existing zoning standards, emergency shelters receive a zoning permit most frequently for an unlimited period of time. They're essentially permanent facilities. And I think, as we've talked about in many cases, when we change the zoning, those permits are honored, even if the underlying zoning no longer allows that use or structure to continue. So existing permits within the city that are obtained are able to continue in perpetuity unless they're discontinued. The interim facility proposes a different permit structure. This is a structure that would include permits that are only valid for 1 year. They can only be approved for that single year. They may seek to renew a permit for an additional year, up to 2 times, so for a total of 3 years maximum, but it's for 1 year increments at a time. It's not for 3 years. And in order to continue beyond 3 years, it's required that the shelter would have to seek a permit under our permanent facility standards, which means that all of the limitations on location, process for the permit, other conditions of review would all be applicable before the permit would be issued. It would have to be met really before the permit could be issued. We modeled some of the language that was added to the ordinance in response to some of the concerns by the commission about how do we really ensure that this shorter term horizon for the permits actually happens. So we actually modeled the language that was added to the ordinance that's in your packet tonight off of a section of our standards that talks about how permits can be issued in the urban reserve district. For those of you that are not familiar, the urban reserve zoning district is a sort of temporary zoning district all in its own, but really limits in a very significant way the types of uses and structures that can be added in the urban reserve until the community decides about the fate of that part of the city. So there are standards in place in that zoning district that limit permits to 2 years at most, and require that the site must return to a pre-permit condition or use when that permit expires. So this language that we've added here is really modeled off of that precedent. And then the next piece of this is about operations. Under our existing standards for emergency shelters, they have pretty limited specific requirements that pertain to emergency shelters. The first is just a requirement that there be on-site management during operation, and it adds a ratio for how many staff must be on site. And then otherwise, the specific operations of an emergency shelter are really reviewed under our citywide general conditional use standards. And I think notably the pieces of that conditional use review process that apply to the conversations we've been having are about, character of the area, which is really intended to be looking at what is the purpose of the zoning district, and limiting any potential for nuisance impacts, which are above and beyond what other uses in the district would be expected to contribute. In the case of the emergency shelters, we have also added some language in response to some of your questions and feedback from earlier meetings. So it still requires on-site management, but also requires the submission of an approved operations plan and outlines the specific categories that need to be addressed in that operations plan, which include the staffing plan, supportive services for the guests, rights and responsibilities of the guests, how the site and the guests will be protected, so the safety aspects, public health procedures, community relations, and collecting data on the users of the site and how long their stays are and how they're transitioning out. I know we also heard some feedback about concern about CEDO being the organization that would be responsible for approving these plans. And so this is something that I want to invite Brian to talk a little bit more about, kind of who would be the appropriate person to approve those. Brian, we can't hear you.
Okay, you missed all of the good stuff I said, but I'll try and repeat it. Just kidding. The actual review is something we've discussed with a couple of entities. One is the State of Vermont Office of Economic Opportunity that oversees a number of programs and funding sources to assist emergency shelter providers. Their response was essentially, if this receives funding from us, we will be reviewing every detail and probably more detail than we want to get into, but we can't make a sort of categorical commitment to reviewing, every operations plan, because it's theoretically possible that a shelter would operate without our funding. And so that put them into a place of, as the state wanting to only regulate what they have to regulate and not feeling comfortable with extending their reach. So one idea that we've batted around internally is the regional entity that is called the Continuum of Care, which is a federal actual requirement in order to receive federal funds that come to this region through our city. The Continuum of Care has to not only operate, but it has to operate with bylaws, and it needs to operate under formal procedures for warning meetings and votes on allocating funding. And so there's a number of pieces that are involved in that. The Continuum of Care consists of a variety of organizations with representation from, has to be someone with a law enforcement position, someone with actually medical health, and someone with a mental health background. So there's a number of criteria that need to be fulfilled in order to operate the Continuum of Care. That entity, would make some sense because they have subject matter expertise to make a review and to provide that review to the planning staff or to the DPI staff in terms of reviewing an operations plan. So that is an approach that would give an independent review that one might think would not come from a department like CEDO that's proposing a project, but rather from other entities who are in the business.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. And then just quickly to wrap up here, the last piece, nothing major different here. Just want to make sure that it's clear that this does propose two different structures for permitting, where under our permanent facilities, they follow our existing standards either as a permitted or conditional use. And under the proposed interim facility, they would be permitted administratively with a pre-application neighborhood meeting and approval of that operations plan, again, with time-limited permits. And I think it is important to note that under any of these scenarios, a zoning permit for these facilities does have an appeal opportunity. There are different lengths of time in which an appeal can be submitted and a different body that would hear them, depending on whether it's a permitted or conditional use, but all of them do have an appeal process. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just hope that was helpful in kind of grounding this discussion in the broader picture, as well as addressing a couple of the follow-up points that you had asked us to think more about in your last discussion. And happy to jump over to the actual ordinance language to talk through any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Thank you, Brian. Commissioners, any questions or comments from what we just heard or anything else? Bruce?
I just have a quick question, Megan. Sub 3 said that the facilities will be on city-owned property or in coordination with the city. Does that mean it can be on other than city-owned property?
Yeah, so that means that it could potentially, like, think about a church or another civic facility, but it would have to be under an operational agreement with the city to operate.
Thanks. I was just confused by the side because your slide at one point was only on city-owned property. I think it's important.
Yeah.
To get that.
Yeah. That's a good clarification.
Anyone else?
I just had a thought for Brian, and this point is probably super remedial, but it was really good to hear, you going over the December Housing Action Plan points, and that it would be helpful at the neighborhood meeting for whatever site we're talking about. I know we're talking about the zoning in general and not a specific place, but it would be helpful for neighbors to know where this is going, that this is a temporary site, that, the city has a very firm plan and commitment to housing people permanently and moving them out of these pods. So that's my thought.
No, thanks. All that type of feedback is really helpful for us. We have met with many different constituents and stakeholders. I just want to point out that it was mentioned earlier that we haven't met with neighbors or with business interests, or there's really, since this has been rolling quickly, we have met with about a dozen different separate sort of meetings, and with but I would say that we as a city decided to move forward on a selection process which had our own internal criteria for what we believed was most likely to achieve the best outcomes. But it wasn't a process that went out and solicited sort of neighborhood votes on whether, I think Commissioner Lee said, if you ask anyone, they're going to say, this is a great idea, but it shouldn't go near me. And I think that's what we were afraid of. So honestly, the process has not been to go out and poll the neighbors on how popular this would be to be situated there. So I hope you can appreciate that challenge.
I do.
Andy, you do have a hand.
Bruce, go ahead.
Just a question, Brian, on how many of these do you think you need? It looks like a short-term sort of ordinance, because you think long-term you'd be able to permit them on a more permanent basis. So how many of the 50 unit have you assessed the need, I guess is the question. And what is that?
Yeah, in this instance, it's planned to be a 30 pod development. So there's actually 30 pods. And is that what you're asking about, or are you asking?
No, I mean, we're being asked to allow for something over a large landmass in the city. How many, and administratively approved with no meaningful neighborhood input, and the appeal right being there, but the appeal would have to be sustained because there's no standards other than having a plan. So, obviously there's concern over how many there might be and unintended consequences. So I think we're sympathetic to the need, but trying to address the need more surgically than what looks like about 25% of the landmass in the city being available to this.
Yeah, so this is not intended to be the beginning of multiple proposals. This is really intended to be what's coming forward now. And I think this has created perhaps some confusion and misunderstanding, is that we're going to go through permitting for the project on Elmwood. That's going to go through permitting. So this was really attempting to recognize that emergency needs arise, and the systems that we have today for land use regulation don't provide enough agility and nimbleness to respond to those needs, rather than this particular project at this moment. So I guess I can't say we won't come back in a couple of years if this need is persists, and that the ability to permit and assemble financing for projects is continues to be bogged down, or people engage in permit appeals, and all of a sudden we have multi-year delays on big projects. I can't really say too far out in the future, because I'd be crystal balling it, and that's always challenging.
How about now? Like, what do you think the need is now?
Beyond the 30 that we're doing, we're not quantifying we're not measuring any other additional need right now. Doesn't mean there's not a need there, just means this is the most it's a manageable project at this point, both in terms of funding, in terms of land area, and it's 30 is a significant contribution to the problem, but it's not necessarily we're not pretending this is going to solve the entire problem of those experiencing homelessness.
How many do you expect, how many people do you expect would be in a single pod? Would it be, like 1 or 2 or a family of 4, something like that?
But there'll be no families here. This is not suitable for family housing. This will be these are 8x8 structures. So these are, these are going to be single people with the exception of, I think we're going to have 5 of the pods will have the ability to have a second bed pulled out from underneath the existing bed. So there'd be ability for 2 people in 5 of the pods.
Thanks.
Eves, I think your hand is up.
It is. Here, let me put it back. Well, I'll put it back down after. So, Brian and Megan, I get it. And I know you guys are doing your best and thank you for everything you've done to try to make this a little better. I guess all I'd say is, at the end of the day, what worries me about what is happening here is the fact that, and maybe I've missed it, but to me, this is an experiment. You can say you've looked at Seattle, and I read about Seattle today, and it seems like the high barrier shelters have a pretty high success rate because those are people who kind of really want to and need help. But the low barrier shelters are hard, and this is a low barrier shelter. And at Sears Lane, we saw what happened at North Beach a couple of years ago. And, I guess what I would ask and, sort of put out there is 2 things. I'd really, again, to me, this is kind of a non-starter unless there is an absolute managing entity who has said, we will be responsible for this. We'll take care of cleaning these, we'll be all over it. And I know the continuum of care is there, but I'm not sure, unless I missed it, if they've agreed to, really manage this project on a 24/7. That's the one missing ingredient. And I guess the other missing ingredient to me is, community interaction and public interaction and DRB planning process is good because it's a check. There's checks and balances and they're there for a reason. And I would be much more comfortable with this if you came to us and said, look, we want you to bless this and moving forward. But 6 months from now, we're really going to take stock and see, is this working? And if it's not, we are willing to take it back or amend it significantly or change it. Because this, again, the lack of review, the lack of public input concerns me. And I do feel like, it would be I'd be so much happier to be able to support it if there was that kind of a mechanism to say, look, we're going to look at it for six months. After 6 months, we're going to look at it again after a year. And then if it's been good for a year, then we'll go for a year. And but every year we're going to look again and see, is this working? What are our issues? What is the community saying? What do they want for changes? Because that's fair.
Yes, I can't see you, Commissioner Bradley, but if you can see me, I've been nodding my head. The concept that management is critical is one that we share, and this I have said, and I will repeat, and the mayor has agreed that we can't go forward with this project until we have management completely, not just figured out, but really in a robust way, having a management arrangement that is, is well funded, is adequately staffed, and has people with the right training. So we're taking that very, very seriously because it will not be a success for the neighbors or for the residents of a shelter village if we don't do that part right. So that's an absolute commitment. And I think your suggestion to have an opportunity to review it 6 months in is actually a really good one. And we're planning to convene a community advisory committee, if you'll call it, whatever you want to call it, but that would include neighbors, would include nearby business owners, it would include residents of the shelter. So it very much needs to be that. And I think even requiring a 6 month review and report out would be something we'd be fine with.
Could I actually ask a clarifying question on that point for Eves? When you were suggesting the, 6 month reviews, were you meaning of an operating site, or did you mean about the changes to the ordinance?
You're on mute, Eves.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, Andy. I had to pull over so I don't kill anybody. What I was saying really was, you know, and again, Brian, thanks for, you know, for what you just said, because that really does help quite a bit. And if, you know, that is the attitude, that's a really good way to go into it. What I really meant, Megan, was, you know, I do think that there has to be a bit of a process that, you know, people need to sign off on this thing. And it seems like we're getting closer to that. What I meant was a working site. So, you know, the day this opens, 6 months from when you open, you know, there is a meeting scheduled to say, okay, what do we do? You know, if this is a disaster, or, you know, just to review it and see, you know, could it be made better? What have the issues been? How have the police responded? You know, is this something that's really, you know, and I look at, and again, it's anecdotal because I haven't talked to anybody directly, but, you know, one of the things I am very aware of is that when a new place opened on Shelburne Road, the surrounding neighbors have really, really noticed a pretty big change in their quality of life. And, you know, that's not okay. They didn't sign up for that. It just sort of happened to them. And I'm sensitive to that. And I know you all are as well. And that's what I don't want, is to have something that, you know, really is problematic. And, you know, the other piece that I will point out, and again, it's, you know, I know there's really no place that's great to put this, but, you know, Elmwood Avenue and the post office is the main place where all the high school kids go at the end of the day to get the bus and all, you know, go home to their various places and or get picked up. So it's in close proximity. So again, I feel like, you know, what worries me about this is I just want to make sure that there are indeed checks and balances there, and that we're really taking the pulse of it and making sure that we're doing something good as opposed to potentially doing something bad. And I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying we have to have a system in place to do something if it really is not working out the way we had expected.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Bruce?
I guess further to Eve's point, I think there should be some process, and then there should be some way to measure success or failure. And I think the leveling effect of the DRB process is that if the first one wasn't provided some very negative consequences or was viewed in the community as a net negative, the applicant would be forced to defend how they operated the first one. And they could either defend it very well if they did a great job and they would get the second opportunity, or they could not. So this eliminates that opportunity for the community completely. So the two are sort of combined for me. It's process and some measurable standards. So if you're going to have an operating agreement, what should be in the operating agreement? How would you measure success or failure? If we were to identify the need as 500 people short term and we attracted another 1,000 from Barry in another place, would that be problematic to us? And I think probably when CEDO interviewed the folks that they've asked to manage this, they were asked a lot of questions that we don't even know to ask and what should be in that. The last time we were here, we mentioned how we made, I think someone mentioned how we made zoning easier with form-based code. A form-based code is highly prescriptive. It says exactly what is needed to control many of those externalities related to the use. And that's what we're looking for. That's what I'd be looking for here is, how do we measure success? What are the standards to live by that CEDO could live with, so that we can balance what the community needs generally and what this subset of the community needs as well. That's kind of where I sit. And I think by doing that, we would prevent some unintended consequences, perhaps.
So just picking up along that line, we have this set up, or this is set up with the interim facilities and the permanent facilities. And I get the need for the interim facilities, which is there's an immediate need and there's not really time to go through the whole process. It's almost like an emergency need. But why not? But then the interim could stretch out over, a 3-year period. Why not have the interim be like 1 year? And if you want to continue there, then you go for the regular permit application, go through the permanent facilities process. And perhaps if during that year you file it you follow your permit and you're going through that process, you can continue there as long as, the process is ongoing. But to me, stretching it out for 3 years, in a way, undermines the interim facility component of it, the interim need. The interim need, again, is, as I understand it, is there's an immediate need, there's almost an emergency need, you need the shelters. So yeah, go through that process and put them up. But once you've done that, if you want to keep it there, then start the process of going through the regular permitting, and that will really give people the chance to weigh in, or, do that review and make sure that it's really working. Hopefully they are, but to me, it's that the continuing for 2 more years with basically, at least under the code that we have in front of us, with no real review or no real benchmarks other than it's in the right it's in a location that's an allowable location. That's, to me, seems like it's the only real criteria of, whether the permit gets renewed or not, the interim permit gets renewed or not. So if it's an emergency need, let that happen, create that. But then now that you've fulfilled that immediate need, go through the regular permitting process that's otherwise laid out in this code. That's a thought that I've had on this.
Yeah, I think maybe one reaction that I have to that is in thinking about the whole package of what's in front of you right now. The one potential risk there of shortening the window for an interim facility could just be that there are some minor changes to where an emergency shelter could be allowed, like in the enterprise district, for example. So if that permit was issued within one of those areas for just that first year, there actually is not that path forward for establishing it under the current process for more than 1 year. And I think there could be some challenges with that, just in terms of like thinking about how, even as an intended short-term facility, there could be some fit up needs that could require this to operate for slightly longer than 1 year. That could then be shut down essentially under that. So that's one, just one quick thought that I have about that.
Anyone else? Thanks, Megan. Michael?
Can appreciate the various objectives that are at play here. I think, as I expressed last time, my concern is just that this perhaps takes some incentive away from the very hard work of putting together, the capital stack and permitting, et cetera, that's necessary for permanent housing, because it will always be an easier solution. Just given, what has always been very, very difficult projects to put together. But I think more immediately, as I hear this, I'm sort of wondering if the existing system sort of works. I mean, the Elmwood Avenue is moving forward. There is some process for input, and is perhaps instead the issue that this as an allowed use, just we need to expand the areas in which this is an allowed use. To Andy's point there. So I guess I just raised that as a question, because we have a mechanism that does actually seem to be working to some degree, maybe isn't as flexible as folks would like, but at the same time, once you get beyond a year or two, anyway, it really does start to look pretty permanent, particularly since, some amount of the population will start to rely on that for their housing.
Yeah, I think it's a good question about whether our system is working now. I mean, obviously we do have emergency shelters within the city that have been permitted under that structure. They're more permanent facilities that have been permitted under that structure. So I think the question as to whether our current system works for this more kind of rapid, flexible deployment model is an open question in my mind. CEDO is currently pursuing a permit, but I mean, I think they're at the very early stages of that. So I don't know how long it will take them to get a permit or what that road will actually ultimately look like for them to come out and be able to start work on a site.
Bruce?
You know, when I read this, I agree that the conditional use standards, so I think it's not just location, Michael. The conditional use standards are sort of broad and maybe not applicable if we want these not to be appealed by a narrow swath of people, if that makes any sense, right? I would be more supportive of something that narrowed the criteria for evaluation and measurement, along with Andy's suggestion of making them shorter, because then the permitting process is very short. You go to the NPA, you go to DRB, it's appealed, but there'd be a limited criteria for it to be appealed under, perhaps. And maybe we strike the better balance of, you know, part of government is sort of making people feel like they've been heard and have an opportunity for, sometimes things get put in permits because of comments and aren't appealed, but they make them better for the neighbors. And I think that's what's missing from this.
So Bruce, an example of what I think you might be suggesting is that I can think of, and I don't know if Scott Guston is still here. But you know, there are different reasons that a project might go in front of the Development Review Board. Being a conditional use is one of those reasons, and there are certain public notice, public hearing requirements, and then, you know, this short list of very broad kind of open-ended criteria that the DRB looks at as part of a conditional use application. But there are other examples of project types that the DRB reviews that don't require that sort of full infrastructure. So thinking again about the form code, you know, if a project is under a certain height within the form districts, they can be approved administratively by the staff. But if somebody wants to take advantage of some of the discretionary height limits in the form code, the DRB reviews that height, that additional height, and they have a list of things that they're looking at in approving that additional height. So I think to kind of like extrapolate that model onto this scenario, Bruce, like, are you suggesting that maybe the review mechanism is still the DRB, but instead of using the conditional use standards, we would give them essentially what we've written here as like, it has to be a site this big, it has to have an operations plan, that the DRB reviews them, but not under the conditional use standards?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think it also should be, you know, we should hear more about the type of operating agreement and standards we'd be looking to measure the facility by. I'm sure that maybe these other places have had these items occur, have experienced sort of problems, and how do they deal with them? And I'm also probably, and maybe Brian can answer this, when you asked others to manage these properties, what sort of questions did they ask? Those questions need to be answered at some point, and better off in the early part of the process, and better maybe for government and public involvement there.
I can share with you that the response is primarily around what's available for funding to ensure we can pay staff and attract staff to do the work. What's the expectation as far as numbers of staff? So it's primarily around staff, and sadly, every organization is completely maxed out beyond capacity. So even if you say, well, we're going to pay for the cost of staff people, the answer has been, there's been a few that have said, we don't have the people to oversee or manage the people that will be hired to do this. So we just, you know, it's a challenge that we're dealing with right now. And like I said earlier, when Eve's asked about it, we're not going to go forward with this project until and unless we have a solid management plan that would work for any neighborhood where it's located.
I guess the question would be, would you be willing to have that subject to scrutiny, subject to certain minimum requirements? You know, I think we could develop those if we thought about it in advance. And I think this board's responsibility is to do that, is to come up with ways that we could head off some of the negative externalities that people would be fearful of.
And I guess one of the things that I know this came up at the last meeting, and so we had tried to address this concern around providing the sort of structure of what an operations plan must include. And I don't know, Brian, if you could speak to, like, within those categories that were included in the draft, I would imagine that some of them will be very site specific. The sort of minimum standards might depend on what type of facility it is and how many people are there and who is there. That I'm a little worried about us being able to get the criteria right at a zoning level for the operations of a facility, where that could really be different from one facility to another.
I do think it causes some pause when this suggestion is on the table, just because it won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Although there may be some common themes that emerge, the actual details may vary from site to site or population to population. And what we're dealing with are issues like who gets to visit, what are the hours that people can visit, when does the site have to be cleared in terms of anyone other than the people who are living in the pods, those issues, how do you handle disruptive behavior or conflicts? All of that is going to be written up, but I guess I have to give some more thought as far as whether that would be appropriate and suitable for specific language in the comprehensive development ordinance.
Yves? You're on mute.
Sorry, Andy, I'm a bit of a neophyte. Brian, I get it. And I guess, I'd like to propose something. It sounds like you guys have really heard us, and, that's awesome. And that you get where our concerns are. I don't think that we should be in a position where we are micromanaging the situation. But I do think that, and again, I hate to kick the can down the road, but I don't think we're going to solve this tonight. What I'd love to do is have, you guys come back to us with a little bit more of a plan in terms of accountability, review, and, just, again, you're right. You're going to, the way that this is run is not, you can't forecast it. You can't foresee it. You can't. And there's going to be situations that none of us can even imagine, that's for sure. Or there may be wonderful things that none of us can even imagine. But I think having some principles and some guiding principles that will be abided by is not hard. That's at a macro level. That's at a, as citizens of Burlington, this is what we can expect, and this is what we will not tolerate or not allow, or both. And I think that, we're close. I don't mean to speak for everybody else, but for myself, the fact that you're concerned about it, you want review. This is a response to an emergency. We understand that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that you can circumvent sort of the reviewing process. And this is a hybrid. And so I think we should be able to look at it like that and try to work together to come up with solutions. And it sounds like at this point, we, at least in my opinion, we're working together towards a solution. But I don't think we're going to solve it tonight. But I don't really want to get in the weeds, at least personally, in terms of, the micromanagement of, well, what about this and what about that? But a set of sort of guiding principles that, are the bylaws, or the, do you know what I mean? It just, there's some pretty basic stuff that we can all point to and say, are we doing this or not? Is this achieving this or not? Is this being violated or not? And those are the parameters by which we're going to judge this. But I think that if we can all say, as citizens, as taxpayers, as members of the community, that we've done what we can to make sure that not only are we meeting the need, but we're also meeting the challenges and that we're prepared to face them, that's a great story to tell. And that's where we should all be going.
We can do that. We can come back with those suggested guided principles, and we're willing to work with you on those.
That sounds great. Anyone else?
Awesome. Thank you.
Anyone else, or is this a good place to leave it, Michael?
Yeah, I guess the only thing, the only other question for the commission as to prior experiences, there's obviously going to be an evaluation aspect to this, and just sort of like using transportation pilot projects as an example. Those typically have a period in which they expire, and then folks make a decision as to whether they'll be permanent. I mean, obviously we're doing that with the for lack of a better word, the pods themselves, understanding that it doesn't necessarily need to be pods, but for the ordinance itself is a bit of an experiment. And so just wondering if there's any precedent for a zoning, something that's in the zoning ordinance that could expire or be up for renewal wholesale at some point in time, because the numbers are extraordinary, right? I mean, the survey from 20 to 150, there's clearly something about this moment that is, the problems laid bare by the pandemic, as the ARPA dollars say. And so I wonder if it's time, when hopefully the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, and things have settled to some degree, to evaluate the need, but also evaluate the success of the program. Once it's in the code, it's in the code, and it's sort of no longer a pilot project.
I'm not
So,
familiar with zoning being handled this way, but former Councillor Montrol was a supporter of a concept that was in the mid-90s. The time of sale energy efficiency ordinance was something that he struck a compromise to get it passed for just a discrete area of the city, but it was going to be in 2 years. If it's working, it will expand citywide, was the idea. So it didn't sunset. It actually mushroomed, if you will, or did something else. It grew, 2 years later, and that was a model for an ordinance, but not specifically for. I'm not familiar with anything around zoning that's been done that way. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, Megan. You were about to say something.
oh, that's okay, Brian. I was just going to say, there is a provision in statute to allow for zoning to sunset. Unfortunately, Scott's not here anymore. He has a longer history with the city in terms of knowing whether we've used sunsets in zoning before. There are some pros and cons to that. We most recently talked about sunsets actually in the context of short-term rentals. I think, it's something that we can look into a little bit more if you'd like. There can be some risks associated with it in terms of just remembering that it has sunset, and making sure that we're administering the ordinance appropriately according to those deadlines that are in it. But there is a tool enabled in statute for an ordinance to essentially expire. So.
Andy?
Yves, yes, go ahead.
I just want to address that last point. Realistically, I think that for us as commissioners, again, sensitivity to the immediate issue at hand and trying to help solve it is one thing. I think where we may end up going is we're going to need to make some changes in the zoning ordinance based on this type of need, because I don't necessarily see this disappearing in the next year. So, that can be the long-term goal. And I think, we should, there should be but again, we're treading on ground that no one has tread on before. So we kind of have to, as long as we're comfortable that we are doing this in a really responsible manner, I think we should allow it to move forward and then look at the lessons that we learn and use that to dictate sort of where we go with the zoning. Because again, zoning is static. We all know that, but it changes. It needs to evolve to meet the needs of the community as they change.
Yep. Yep. Brian, thanks for the trip down memory lane. I remember that now. I've forgotten about that one. But you know, on the question in Burlington over whether we have done temporary zoning with automatic sunsets, I actually don't remember that we've done that. We may have, but I don't remember any instance where we've done. But what I do recall us having done, both in zoning and in other things, is to have almost an automatic callback time to say, you know, this item needs to come back to the planning commission or to the city council, like in 1 year or in 2 years for a review to be done. Because on some things like this, it's very likely that whatever we do today isn't going to be, absolutely correct. You'll learn a lot over the next couple of years, I'm sure. And so you want to make, so in that sense, you have a requirement that it come back for a visit, and you could do another review of it and see from lessons learned. It's not to say we if it's on in the statutes we can't do it on a temporary basis, but I think what I recall us having done is having automatic returns to us or to the council to take a look at it.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I can't think off the top of my head of anything that I remember having heard was a sunset provision in our ordinance, like maybe 1 or 2 minor things that were in there at some point, but that's probably more likely is some kind of setting up a process to make sure that it gets reviewed again in the future.
Bruce?
This is maybe in the weeds a little bit, but the table at 5.4.13, I think, says it's permitted in all zoning districts except RCOA and, another of the RCOs, but it allows for it in RCOG, which I think is parks. Is there a way to take parks off the table? And, it still would be permitted almost anywhere in the city. Just seems like our parks are places for families and they won't necessarily be compatible with this.
Yeah, I mean, if that's an area of the city that the commission isn't comfortable with, we can scale that back. The original reason for including it there was just thinking about the precedent for places like North Beach, which is in an RCO-RG district. But if that's an area of the city that the commission isn't comfortable with, this use being allowed, because that's an area of the city where it's not allowed today, that's a change that could be made.
I think that's a fair trade.
Okay.
Am I muted?
No, we heard you. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
I'm just concerned about the possibility of taking off parks in case they're needed, like on an emergency basis. So it's just a thought, it's a lot of space where you could put emergency shelters for maybe for a more limited time, but I don't want to further carve this up either.
Michael, were you raising your hand? Maybe
Is that
not.
for me?
Yeah.
Sorry. My computer froze. Apologies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak in support of Bruce's comment there. The parks do feel a little threatened these days with secondhand smoke and the like for a number of different reasons when I'm around with my kids. So I support that idea.
Okay. So I think we've had a pretty good discussion tonight. It sounds like there's more work to be done. It sounds like there's a willingness, like Brian, Megan, to take a deeper look at it, come back with some of the guidelines, guideposts, like what you've talked about and what some others have talked about. So I'm not sure if we have more for tonight, but I think we made good progress tonight in helping this move forward. Anyone else? Great. Thanks a lot. Look forward to the continuing discussion on this one. I think we're going to get somewhere really good on this.
Thanks, Brian, for being here. I think it was really helpful to have a subject matter expert in this area be more involved in this discussion.
Thanks for taking this up. Appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
So we'll close out this item, move on to item 7, which are commissioner items. Our next meeting is April 26th at 6:30. Are there any other commissioner items?
Ordinance.
I have one, Andy.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that Moreau put out a statement today that Bill Truex has passed away. And I've got to say that Bill was a friend of mine. We were on the BBA board for many, many years. And he, as you may or may not know, was one of the primary architects of creating the Church Street Marketplace and has done a tremendous amount to help, you know, create the waterfront as it is now. And so I just want to mention that he's passed away and, you know, sing his praises. I think it's
Well,
fair
thank
to
you
do.
for letting us know. I'd missed that.
Yeah.
I saw that. Thanks, Heath.
Okay. Is there anybody else? All right, so we'll move on to item 8, which are minutes and communications. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications?
I would like to move that we accept those minutes and communications.
Some motion by Alex. Is there a second by? Seconded by Bruce. We have a motion by Alex, second by Bruce. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Great, that passes. And we have motion to adjourn is our next item. Motion to adjourn by Eve, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of the motion to adjourn, say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye. Thanks, everyone. Good discussion tonight.
We stand adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
You too. Take care.
I don't want to have